Before dawn on a winter's morning, Tim Sears arrives at the Blue Anchor pub at Helston in Cornwall to begin his day at work. It will be many hours yet before the first customers arrive. But Tim does not sell the beer, he makes it. He's one of the Brewers of Helston. Coinage Hall Street in Helston. Sid and Pat Cannon, too, are starting their day at work. Pat is the pub's licensee, and her husband, Sid, its head brewer. Throughout Britain, beer enthusiasts know the pub for its home-brewed real ale, with its distinctive taste and puzzling name. The Blue Anchor is the home of Spingo. Beer, of course, is mainly water, except that brewers call water liquor. Overnight, 120 gallons of it, drawn from a well beneath the pub, has been brought to the boil ready for the day's brew. With the temperature checked, Sid and Tim are ready for their first step, adding malted barley, 250 pounds of it, to make what brewers call the mash. Nowadays, commercial brewing usually takes place on a vast scale, often using modern and automatic machinery, but the basic process is much the same as this. Tim Sears and his boss, Sid Cannon, are brewing only what this one pub can sell. It's a cottage industry, familiar enough here where things have not changed much for 150 years. But the Blue Anchor is now one of only a handful of pubs in Britain still brewing their own beer.
The temperature usually works out at around 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Adding more boiling water, usually just a couple of bucketfuls, will bring this temperature back up to about 150, which is a critical temperature. You can't really sort of go much either way on that. You perhaps get away with half a degree, but nothing much more than that. So that's going to be pretty spot on.
Brewing is an old established craft, but Sid Cannon is a newcomer to it. He began only 4 years ago, almost by accident.
I was a coal merchant, working in Reading, with my brothers. And I also used to run a social club. I was secretary of the social club for 12 years. And the wife said to me, Pat, she said, that we should, instead of working for the social club, we should run a pub of our own. To get a small pub for ourselves. And we applied for 1 or 2 other pubs before this one come up. Then we see this one in the Dalton Weekly, and we applied for it and come down here for an interview and was accepted. When I come down and had the interview for it, they said you had to brew your own beer, and I agreed. And with Mr. Richards, who is the owner of the place, that his son would carry on brewing for me. But when I got down here, I wanted to get on and do the brewing myself. When I first come down here, I didn't know the first thing about brewing. So I went up and I used to start brewing with them in the morning, and I went through the brews with them, but the beer still didn't come up to anywhere near good. the actual ingredients was the same. They didn't touch the ingredients at all, but they condemned everything we had in wood, and they told me to change the yeast, and here they would only wash and eat with cold water. And they told me to get a steam cleaner and steam clean and sterilise everything and all the utensils we use in brewing. And that's what made all the difference.
Tim, too, is a newcomer. Like many young men, he brewed beer at home in his spare time, and he won 3 county trophies. Then he answered an advertisement in the local paper for a job helping Sid Cannon at the Blue Anchor. And a relaxing pastime developed into a full-time responsibility.
I would say that it's easier than I expected it to be, but it's certainly different because you get used to using larger quantities of everything, basic ingredients and finished product. Whereas at home I'm sort of used to brewing either from grain or malt extract. Then here it's all grain, and at home it may be sort of anything from sort of 5 to 20 pound of malt at home. Here it's sort of 200 odd pound of malt, so there's a considerable increase.
After an hour or so, the mash is ready. A pump is primed, and the contents of the mash tun, now known as the wort, will be transferred back into the copper to be boiled again. Now a further essential ingredient, hops, will be weighed and added to the wort.
Well, the hops add bitterness. Originally, hops were used as a preservative in ale, but they have become more a feature of the flavour rather than the preservative values. Like I say, if you didn't add the hops, then you'd have a reasonably bland sort of tasting beer. You wouldn't have the bite. Having added the hops, we turn the gas up full. And it takes about an hour for that to get back up to the boil. The gas is then cut back so that it simmers quite nicely, and that simmers for an hour.
Oh yes, you had to. You see, it was excellent. Games prize. Yeah, lovely. Yeah. Really good. Yeah.
By now, the pub has opened for lunchtime business. Beer drinkers are creatures of habit, and the bar is soon full of familiar faces and talk of favourite beers. Amongst those regulars is a man whose grandfather bought the pub in 1871 in rather unusual circumstances. He's retired now, but still the owner of the Blue Anchor, Geoffrey Richards.
Oh yes, he was prospecting for gold in California and made quite a lot of money in those days, and came home. And I think he was living at Brieg at the time. And he came to Helston, dropped in the Blue Anchor for a drink, and there was no one in the bar. So he said, where's everyone? You know, where's they all gone? All they said, they're selling the pub upstairs, the big room upstairs. So he went up, nobody bid, and he put in a bid for £350 to start the auction. You see. Nobody spoke. So it was knocked down to him. He had no deposit on him, not sufficient deposit, which they had to borrow to buy the pub. And he went home and said to his young wife of 16 and a half, she was just 16 and a half, I bought the Blue Anchor at Helston, which was quite a thing in those days because it was the centre of the mining area. And pubs then, well, they were quite tough for the miners coming in. I think probably the brewery was built, I would say, in the middle of the 18th century because the beams are all wood pegged, no nails in the beams, you see. And originally it was supposed to be a monk's rest house, or probably a church house. And of course monks always brewed the beer, and probably when they gave up, they then built a brewery of that type of the bag.
Helston today is a pleasant market town, businesslike in winter and bustling with visitors in summer. When Geoffrey Richards' grandfather ran the Blue Anchor, the town's wealth came from the mining industry. Nearby were Great Work, Wheel Vore, and Bassett and Grills, enterprises that helped to make Cornish miners famous and Helston's 30-odd pubs profitable. Most of the pubs had their own brew houses, and some, including the Blue Anchor, became places where the miners would come to receive their week's wages. The practice was eventually made illegal, but in the middle of the last century, the miners, their money and their drinking, at times made Helston rather different from the attractive, ordered place it seems today.
We have visitors here from all over the world, not only in this country, but we have Americans here, Australians, where they've not only read about it in their own country, but they've bought me magazines with it in from their own publications, with us in it. You know, the locals, in the summer, they do object a little bit, because they get taken over by the holiday makers. But in the winter, they all come back again in the winter. Yeah, some of them do leave us in the summer.
How did you get down here?
Sunday? I got someone who lived in Rotherhithe about 3 months ago. They just moved down here across the river from me.
It's the National Centre for Orchestral Studies, which is based in London, and it's a one-year orchestral course designed to give musicians experience in orchestras. And we've come down to Falmouth to do Eugene Onegin with the Duchy of Cornwall Opera Company. And we just thought staying in Falmouth. And we discovered this pub in the Good Beer Guide, so we thought we'd give it a go.
Good. Coming on my loves anymore? All right. Yeah. Is that it? We doing? Hang on, hey,
Back in the brew house, the hop wort has been simmering in the copper for an hour or so. Fortified by his lunch, Tim again applies muscle power for the next stage of his 100-gallon brew.
The hot hopped wort is then transferred by bucket from the copper to the top tray. And from this top tray then flows out slowly through the tap, over the outside of the copper cone, which has got cold water running through it, and it collects in the bottom tray. The difference in temperature between the top tray and the bottom tray is something in the region of 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's virtually boiling at the top tray and hopefully about 60 degrees Fahrenheit at the bottom tray. Now there are other pipes in the bottom tray fed with cold water from the well, and this also helps to cool things down. It just takes the edge off, whereas the copper cone takes most of the heat away.
boiling has extracted the goodness from the hops and sterilized the wort. By now, the character of the beer has been fixed, and the wort is now cool enough to be transferred to the fermenting vessel for the next crucial stage. As yet, the beer has no alcohol content. One more ingredient must now join the brew in order to convert a rather unappetizing sort of vegetable soup into good bitter ale. That important ingredient is yeast.
Having got some of the wort into the fermenting vessel number 2, then some yeast is weighed out into a bucket, something like 7 to 8 pounds for each brew, and then add some wort slightly warmer than would require, something in the region of something like 70 degrees Fahrenheit to make up a yeast starter. And this is then mixed up by hand and then suspended over the fermenting vessel so that it actually starts to work, and then froth out over the top of the bucket and actually drop into the brew. Now this provides us with a visual check as to the condition of the yeast. If after, say, half an hour, there wasn't a lot of activity, then we'd know full well that there wasn't sufficient live yeast cells within that particular batch of yeast to ferment our brew.
So having proved that the yeast is working, it can now join the brew together with the rest of the wort.
Having got all the wort over into the fermenting vessel, we then have to do a final gravity check. That is to make sure of the gravity of the finished product. Now, earlier on, we were aiming for something on or above the finished gravity, but now we're, all being well, we're now maybe 4 or 5 degrees above that. So therefore, we have to add cold water to the finished wort to bring the gravity down.
Tim must now make 2 measurements required by law. Customs and excise duty is paid on a brew before the yeast goes to work. A measure of the amount of fermentable solids, and therefore of the eventual alcoholic strength of the beer, is given by taking the specific gravity with a hydrometer.
Now, having done that and got the gravity down to a hydrometer reading, saccharometer reading of 50, we're okay. So then, having done that, we then take what they call a dry dip. Now, it's a stick with a marker on it, which is graduated in centimetres and every 2 millimetres. And from that reading, we can then tell how much beer we've actually made. So, based on the combination of the gravity and the actual volume produced, the Blue Anchor actually pays duty.
Tim's working day is nearly over. He's brewed 120 gallons of medium spingo, but there's still the paperwork. The Customs and Excise require the brewer to keep careful records of each brew. From the original gravity and the measurement of volume will be calculated the amount of duty that the Blue Anchor will pay. And just to make sure that there's no monkey business, the inspector, who has access to the premises at all times, will often arrive unannounced to cast authorities' watchful eye over the proceedings. But not every day is spent brewing. It all depends on the demand in the pub, and that can vary, as Sid Cannon explains.
In the summer, we were brewing every day, 5 days a week. But last summer, we were brewing 6 days a week. We brewed 5 Sundays straight off.
But in the winter?
In the winter, we're at the moment, this week, we're brewing 3 times, but we come down to twice a week. That's about 130 gallon in a brew. Next week we'll be brewing 3 times again because we're working their stuff up for Christmas. When I first come here, they did an Andre beer. It was such a weak beer and such a poor cellar, so I took that off and put on a special beer, which is 1060 gravity. And at Christmas and Easter, we do a extra special beer at 1070 gravity.
Something in the region of 8, 9 o'clock in the evening of the brew, the beer is then siphoned off into fermenting tanks downstairs. Now, because we're only a small brewery, we have special permission from Customs and Excise to move our beer within, after 6 hours. The beer will actually stay and ferment in the fermenting tanks downstairs, known as collecting vessels, for at least 7 days.
Well, anything going, Dave?
Well, all right, thanks. It's progressing as normal.
Well, I'll leave you to it then.
Yeah, okay, Sid. See you in a bit, all right?
Yeah, okay then.
After that week or so in the fermenting tanks, the beer is ready to be racked, siphoned off into barrels. That's the job of David Phillips. The yeast has finished its job. The sugars in the wort have been converted to alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. The spent yeast is skimmed off and will be thrown away. Empty casks, steam cleaned and sterilized, are prepared and filled. And after adding finings to make sure the beer is clear and bright, the latest brew of Spingo will soon be filling the glasses of the Blue Anchor's customers.
Going back in the 18th century, every pub had a skidlally, but now we're the only one to in this area to have a skidlally. It's been a great success, really. We hire at least 4 times a week private parties, and then the rest of the time it's open in the evenings for anybody to play skiddle. I'm glad I come down here because you have to make it your social life, and I thoroughly enjoy doing it, and it's been worthwhile doing, especially when people come in and they come and tell you that they thoroughly enjoyed the pint and they like the beer. You know, it gives you a bit of a lift up and it makes you feel much better for doing it.
If you ask, the beer enthusiast will tell you that home brew pubs are not just remnants of the past. The rise of real ale and the success of places like the Blue Anchor have persuaded others to start new home breweries in many parts of Britain, happily adding to the beer drinker's choice and fueling afresh the saloon bar arguments about which beer is best.